11:47 p.m., a residential street in Arlington, Virginia, 3 miles from CIA headquarters. A man in a gray sedan sat with the engine off, watching a townhouse through light rain. Inside that townhouse, his closest friend since graduate school was putting his children to bed. The man in the car had a miniature camera in his jacket pocket and a decision that would end one life to save thousands of others. He had 90 seconds before the porch light went off, and the choice became irreversible. This was not a scene from a spy novel. This was the operational reality of counterintelligence work during the final decade of the Cold War, when the stakes of betrayal had never been higher, and the lines between friendship and duty had never been thinner. The man in the sedan was Thomas Calloway, a mid-level analyst in the CIA's Soviet East European Division. The man inside was Dr. Richard Brennan, a Defense Intelligence Agency researcher with top-secret UDSCI clearance who had access to satellite reconnaissance data, nuclear targeting protocols, and the identities of deep-cover assets operating inside the Warsaw Pact. What Calloway had discovered 3 weeks earlier, through a pattern of small inconsistencies that accumulated into certainty, was that Brennan had been passing classified material to a KGB handler for at least 18 months. The question that would define both men's lives was not whether Brennan was guilty. The question was whether Calloway would report him. To understand how this moment came to exist, you have to go back to 1979 to a different kind of Cold War landscape. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had just begun. The Iranian Revolution had toppled the Shah and taken American hostages. SALT II was collapsing. The intelligence community was still reeling from the Church Committee investigations that had exposed illegal domestic surveillance programs and destroyed morale across the CIA and FBI. Recruitment standards had tightened. Vetting procedures had intensified. The culture inside Langley was one of siege mentality and institutional paranoia, where every anomaly was a potential penetration and every friendship was a vulnerability to be assessed. Thomas Calloway had joined the agency in 1977, straight out of a PhD program in Slavic studies at Georgetown. He was fluent in Russian and Polish, had written his dissertation on Soviet agricultural policy, and had the kind of methodical, detail-oriented mind that thrived in the gray zones of intelligence analysis. He was not a field operative. He did not recruit assets or run dead drops or orchestrate defections. He read cables, cross-referenced reports, built dossiers on mid-level Soviet officials, and looked for patterns in the noise. His work was invisible, essential, and utterly unglamorous. He lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Alexandria, worked 60-hour weeks, and had exactly 3 people he considered actual friends. Richard Brennan was one of them. They had met in 1975 during a graduate seminar on Soviet military doctrine. Brennan was pursuing a master's in strategic studies and already working part-time as a contractor for the Defense Intelligence Agency, analyzing satellite imagery of Soviet missile installations. He was brilliant, gregarious, and ideologically committed in a way that Calloway found both admirable and slightly exhausting. Brennan believed in American exceptionalism, in the moral necessity of containing Soviet expansion, in the righteousness of the intelligence mission. Calloway believed in the work because it was intellectually rigorous and because someone had to do it. They became friends because they argued well, because they respected each other's minds, and because in the insular, high-pressure world of the intelligence community, genuine friendship was rare enough to be worth preserving. By 1985, Brennan had risen to a senior research position at DIA. He had a wife, 2 young daughters, a house in Arlington with a mortgage he complained about, and a security clearance that gave him access to some of the most sensitive intelligence products in the U.S. government. He was read into compartmented programs involving reconnaissance satellites, signals intelligence collection against Soviet command and control networks, and the identities of human sources reporting from inside the GRU and KGB. He attended interagency working groups. He briefed senior officials. He was trusted. Calloway had noticed the first anomaly in late September, during a routine review of a contact report filed by a CIA case officer in Vienna. The report mentioned a Soviet diplomat who had shown unusual interest in American satellite capabilities during a social function. The diplomat's name was Yuri Volkov, a second secretary at the Soviet embassy, who was almost certainly GRU. What caught Calloway's attention was a small detail. Volkov had asked specific questions about a classified reconnaissance program that had only been briefed to a handful of people in Washington. The program was so compartmented that even the case officer filing the report did not know its code name. But Calloway did, because he had helped prepare background materials for the briefing, and so did Richard Brennan, who had been one of the analysts presenting the satellite data. It could have been a coincidence. It could have been a lucky guess by a well-informed GRU officer. But Calloway had been trained to treat coincidences as hypotheses requiring investigation. He went back through 6 months of contact reports, looking for other instances where Soviet intelligence officers had demonstrated knowledge they should not have possessed. He found 3 more. In each case, the information involved programs or sources that Brennan had access to. In each case, the Soviet questions had been asked within 2 weeks of Brennan attending a briefing or receiving a classified report. Calloway did not want to believe what the pattern suggested. He spent a week trying to construct alternative explanations. Maybe the Soviets had penetrated the satellite program through technical means. Maybe there was a leak somewhere else in the chain. Maybe Brennan had been careless in a conversation and someone had overheard. But the more Calloway looked, the harder it became to avoid the central, terrible hypothesis. His friend was a spy. The tradecraft of counterintelligence investigation in this era was methodical and invasive. Calloway could not simply confront Brennan or report his suspicions to the FBI without evidence. Accusations of espionage required proof, and proof required surveillance. He began to track Brennan's movements outside of work, using techniques he had learned in training but never expected to deploy against someone he knew. He noted the times Brennan left his office. He followed him to lunch meetings, to evening errands, to weekend trips to the grocery store. He was looking for deviations from routine, for unexplained absences, for the operational signatures of a controlled agent, dead drops, brush passes, signal sites. For 2 weeks, he found nothing. Brennan's life appeared exactly as it should, predictable, domestic, unremarkable. Then, on October 7th, Calloway followed Brennan to a park in Bethesda on a Tuesday evening. Brennan had told his wife he was going to the gym. Instead, he drove to a public park, walked to a specific bench near a children's playground, and sat down with a newspaper. He stayed for 11 minutes. He did not read the newspaper. He did not look at his watch. He simply sat, scanning the area with the careful, practiced movements of someone checking for surveillance. Then he stood, walked to a trash can near the parking lot, and deposited the newspaper inside. He returned to his car and drove home. Calloway waited until Brennan was gone, then retrieved the newspaper. Folded inside the sports section was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten list of 6 alphanumeric codes. Calloway recognized them immediately. They were file designators for classified intelligence reports that Brennan would have accessed in the past month. The list was a signal, a proof of access communication to confirm that Brennan still had the clearance and the access his handlers required. It was not the material itself. Passing documents in a public park would have been too risky, but it was evidence of an active espionage relationship. Calloway photographed the list, replaced the newspaper in the trash can, and left. He now had proof that Brennan was operational. What he did not have was clarity about what to do next. The decision tree facing Calloway was not simple. If he reported Brennan to the FBI, his friend would be arrested, interrogated, and almost certainly convicted under the Espionage Act. Brennan's life would be destroyed. His family would be shattered. His children would grow up with a father in federal prison, branded as a traitor. But if Calloway did nothing, Brennan would continue to pass intelligence to the KGB. American sources inside the Soviet Union would be compromised. Operations would fail. People would die. The damage would compound with every day that Brennan remained in place. There was a third option, one that Calloway considered for exactly 48 hours. Confront Brennan directly, give him a chance to stop, to confess, to cooperate. But this option was a fantasy. If Brennan was willing to betray his country for whatever reason, ideology, money, coercion, he was not going to stop because a friend asked him to. And confronting him would only give him time to destroy evidence, to warn his handlers, to flee. It would make the situation worse. Calloway understood, with a clarity that felt like physical pain, that there was no version of this story where he kept his friend and did his duty. The choice was binary. He could protect Brennan and become complicit in espionage, or he could report Brennan and accept the moral and emotional cost of that decision. He spent 3 days barely sleeping, reviewing the evidence, looking for a way out that did not exist. On October 12th, he walked into the office of the CIA's Deputy Director for Counterintelligence and laid out everything he had found. He brought the photographs of the file designators, the timeline of anomalies, the surveillance logs. He explained the relationship, the access, the pattern. The Deputy Director listened without interruption, asked 4 clarifying questions, and then made a phone call to the FBI's Washington field office. Within 6 hours, a joint CIA-FBI task force had been stood up to investigate Richard Brennan. Calloway was instructed to maintain normal contact with Brennan, to give no indication that anything had changed, and to report any further operational activity. For the next 2 weeks, Calloway lived a double life. He met Brennan for lunch. He answered his phone calls. He listened to stories about Brennan's daughters, about home repairs, about office politics at DIA. And the entire time, he knew that FBI surveillance teams were following Brennan, that his phones were tapped, that his trash was being searched, that every movement was being documented. Calloway felt like he was watching his friend through glass, present but unreachable, waiting for the moment when the glass would shatter. The FBI's investigation moved quickly. They identified Brennan's KGB handler, a diplomat named Viktor Chernyaev operating undercover at the Soviet embassy. They observed 2 more dead drop exchanges, both in public parks, both using the same operational pattern. Brennan would leave a signal, Chernyaev would retrieve it, and a payment would be left in a separate location for Brennan to collect. The payments were modest, never more than $3,000 at a time, which suggested that Brennan was not motivated primarily by money. The FBI suspected ideological recruitment, possibly dating back to Brennan's graduate school years, but they needed Brennan's cooperation to confirm the timeline and the full scope of the compromise. On October 28, 1985, at 6:15 a.m., FBI agents arrested Richard Brennan at his home in Arlington. They executed a search warrant, seized his files, and took him into custody. His wife was not told why. His daughters were still asleep. Calloway learned about the arrest from a phone call at 6:45 a.m. He was told that Brennan had invoked his right to an attorney and was not cooperating. He was told that the damage assessment was ongoing but already catastrophic. He was told that his role in the investigation would remain classified and that he should expect no public acknowledgement of what he had done. Calloway never spoke to Brennan again. The legal proceedings unfolded with the grim efficiency of a national security case. Brennan was charged with multiple counts of espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, and unauthorized disclosure of classified information. The trial was partially closed to protect sources and methods. The evidence presented included the photographs Calloway had taken, the FBI's surveillance logs, and testimony from intelligence officials about the programs Brennan had compromised. Brennan's defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the file designators could have been obtained by someone else, that the meetings in the park were coincidental. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Brennan was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, noted that Brennan's betrayal had endangered the lives of American intelligence officers and foreign nationals who had risked everything to provide information to the United States. The judge did not mention Calloway's name. No one did. The damage assessment took 9 months to complete. Brennan had compromised at least 14 intelligence operations, including the identities of 3 human sources operating inside the Soviet Union. 2 of those sources were arrested by the KGB within weeks of Brennan's communications. 1 was executed. 1 was sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp. The 3rd disappeared and was presumed dead. Brennan had also passed detailed information about U.S. satellite reconnaissance capabilities, which allowed the Soviets to adjust their camouflage and deception efforts and reduce the effectiveness of American overhead collection. The financial cost of the compromise was estimated at over $200 million. The human cost was incalculable. Calloway remained at the CIA for another 6 years. He was promoted twice. He received a commendation that was placed in his classified personnel file and would never be made public. He continued to do the same work, reading cables, building dossiers, looking for patterns. But something had changed. He no longer trusted his instincts about people. He no longer believed that friendship was separate from duty. He had learned that the two could collide, and that when they did, the choice was not really a choice at all. In 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Calloway left the agency. He took a teaching position at a small college in New England, where he lectured on Russian history and never mentioned his previous career. He did not attend reunions. He did not write memoirs. He lived quietly, alone, in a house near the ocean, and he did not talk about Richard Brennan. Brennan served 18 years of his sentence before being released on parole in 2003. He moved to a halfway house in Pennsylvania, worked as a night clerk at a motel, and died of a heart attack in 2007. His obituary did not mention his espionage conviction. His daughters did not attend his funeral. The question that remains, the question that Calloway never answered in the few interviews he gave before his own death in 2019, is whether he believed he had made the right choice. When asked directly, in a 2015 oral history conducted by the CIA's Center for the Study of Intelligence, Calloway said only this: "I did what the job required. Whether that makes it right is not for me to say." But the broader question, the question that this case forces us to confront, is what we ask of the people who do this work. Counterintelligence is not about catching foreign spies in dramatic confrontations. It is about the slow, corrosive process of suspecting everyone, of treating every anomaly as a potential betrayal, of living in a world where friendship and duty are always in tension. It is about the loneliness of being right, when being right means destroying someone you care about. It is about the moral weight of choosing the mission over the person, the state over the individual, the abstract principle of national security over the concrete reality of human connection. Calloway's decision to report Brennan was, by any institutional standard, correct. He followed protocol. He gathered evidence. He acted in accordance with his oath and his training. He prevented further damage. He protected sources. He did his job. But the cost of that correctness was a friendship, a family, and a piece of his own humanity that he never fully recovered. The Cold War produced thousands of cases like this, though most remain classified. The archives are full of reports about assets who were betrayed, operations that were compromised, and the counterintelligence officers who had to make impossible choices in real time. What makes Calloway's case unusual is not the mechanics of the investigation, those were standard, but the relationship. Most espionage cases involve strangers or colleagues with professional distance, or targets who are already suspected. Calloway had to investigate someone he trusted, someone he had known for a decade, someone whose children called him Uncle Tom. The psychological literature on betrayal trauma suggests that the damage is not just about the act itself, but about the shattering of the assumptive world, the fundamental beliefs we hold about who is safe, who is trustworthy, who we are in relation to others. For Calloway, the betrayal was double. Brennan had betrayed the country, and Calloway had to betray the friendship. The second betrayal was necessary, but it was still a betrayal, and it left a mark that no commendation could erase. There is also the question of what drove Brennan to espionage in the first place. The FBI's post-arrest investigation suggested that Brennan had been recruited during an academic conference in Europe in 1982, where he had met a Soviet intelligence officer posing as a scholar. The recruitment had been ideological, not financial. Brennan had become disillusioned with American foreign policy, particularly in Central America, and had convinced himself that passing information to the Soviets was a form of moral correction, a way to prevent what he saw as reckless escalation. He believed, according to his debriefing statements, that he was serving a higher principle. This is the paradox at the heart of many espionage cases. The spy often believes he is acting morally, even as he commits one of the most serious crimes a citizen can commit. Brennan saw himself as a whistleblower, as someone willing to risk everything to stop what he perceived as American aggression. Calloway saw him as a traitor who had endangered lives and violated the trust placed in him. Both men were acting according to their own moral frameworks, and both frameworks led to destruction. The institutional response to the Brennan case was swift and comprehensive. The CIA and DIA implemented new compartmentation protocols to limit the damage a single insider could cause. They tightened vetting procedures for personnel with access to sensitive programs. They increased the frequency of polygraph examinations and expanded the scope of financial and lifestyle monitoring. They created new training programs to teach officers how to recognize the behavioral indicators of espionage. They built systems designed to prevent the next Richard Brennan. But systems cannot account for the human element. They cannot predict when someone will decide that their personal beliefs outweigh their professional obligations. They cannot prevent the slow drift from disillusionment to rationalization to action. They cannot eliminate the possibility that someone you trust will betray you, or that you will have to be the one to stop them. Calloway understood this. In his 2015 oral history, he said, "We can build all the safeguards we want. We can polygraph people until they hate us. We can monitor every email and every phone call. But in the end, espionage is a human problem, and human problems do not have technical solutions. Someone has to notice. Someone has to care enough to act, and that someone has to be willing to live with the consequences." The consequences for Calloway were isolation and silence. He could not talk about what he had done, even to the people who might have understood. The case was classified. The details were sealed. His role was redacted from every public document. He carried the knowledge alone, and it shaped the rest of his life in ways that were invisible to everyone around him. The consequences for Brennan were imprisonment, disgrace, and the loss of everything he had built. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. His family was shattered. He spent 18 years in a federal penitentiary, most of it in protective custody because convicted spies are not safe in general population. He was released into a world that had moved on, where the Cold War was history and his betrayal was a footnote. He died alone, unreconciled, convinced to the end that he had been right. The consequences for the sources Brennan compromised were execution, imprisonment, and exile. Their names remain classified. Their families do not know what happened to them. They are the invisible casualties of a war fought in shadows, and their sacrifice is known only to the officers who recruited them and the analysts who read their reports. This is what counterintelligence costs. Not just the operational expense, not just the bureaucratic effort, but the human toll of suspicion, betrayal, and necessary cruelty. It costs friendships. It costs trust. It costs the belief that the people we know are who they say they are. And it costs the officers who do the work a piece of their own moral certainty, because they have to live with the knowledge that they were right to suspect, right to investigate, and right to destroy. Calloway's choice was not heroic. It was not dramatic. It was simply the choice that the job required, made by a man who understood what it would cost and did it anyway. He did not save the world. He did not stop a war. He prevented some damage, protected some sources, and upheld the institutional mechanisms that make intelligence work possible. And he lost his friend. In the end, the question is not whether Calloway made the right choice. The question is whether we are willing to ask people to make choices like that, and what we owe them when they do. The intelligence community honors its heroes in secret ceremonies, with medals that cannot be worn in public and commendations that cannot be framed. It asks for sacrifices that will never be acknowledged, and loyalty that will never be rewarded with recognition. It creates situations where doing the right thing means betraying someone you love, and then it asks you to live with that quietly, without complaint, without support. Calloway did that. He lived with it. And when he died, the CIA sent a representative to his funeral, a mid-level officer who stood in the back and did not introduce himself to the family. The officer placed a small, unmarked envelope on the casket before it was lowered into the ground. Inside the envelope was a single sentence, typed on agency stationery. "Your service mattered." It was true. It was also not enough. But it was all the institution had to offer, and Calloway had known that from the beginning. He had known it the night he sat in his car outside Brennan's house, with the rain falling and the porch light about to go off, and he had made the choice anyway. That is what the job required. That is what he gave. And that is what we ask of the people who stand between us and the threats we never see, in the wars we never know are being fought. at a cost we can never fully repay.